All right. Well, I think we can get started. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. This is our second coronavirus event that CLO is doing. And we're going to be focusing on the economics and politics of this for probably about an hour, hour and a half tops. So Calvin Zabraki and I are executive officers for CLO, and our faculty member advisor for it is Dr. Steele. The main guests for this event are Dr. Steele and Dr. Habib. Thank you both for coming, and thank you, Dr. Wolfram, for coming as well. I know you guys must all be busy recording for classes, grading papers and exams and such, so we really appreciate your time, and let's get this started.
Can I interrupt for 1 second?
Absolutely.
I'm going to have to leave at about 1:30 because I'm doing Zoom meetings for my classes. So just when I disappear, it's not because I'm not interested.
Okay, no problem, Dr. Wolfram.
Yeah, and also the same with me, not quite at 1:30, but closer to about 2, maybe 1:45. I have virtual office hours with Zoom with some students who are concerned about their finals. So just wanted to let you know that.
Okay, sounds good. We'll keep it. We'll try and keep this in respect to those times then. So this one goes to Dr. Habib and Dr. Steele, and Dr. Wolfram. Feel free to comment as you'd like as well with them. Our first question is to kind of get this rolling and push us in the direction is, what is the proper role of the federal government in relation to the state governments during this pandemic? What is its proper role? Should it be taking the head? Should this be a state issue? And then secondly, with the governors, especially the governor of Michigan, are they acting in a prudent manner by using their executive powers to limit people's interactions and market interactions, or is this an abuse of power?
Dr. Steele, you can go. Go ahead.
Well, I guess my first thought, when you ask whether it's a prudent or abusive use of power, and Dr. Habib is talking about his students in a panic over finals. If the governor wanted to do a prudent use of power, she would have said that finals are unnecessary and we could cancel them and then we could all go home. So I'm really outraged. I think that we should get all the students marching on Lansing because finals don't seem essential to me, especially when I'm grading them. Well, I think that first of all, the question about the federal government is really interesting. I don't think there's any change in the relationship that there should be between federal government and states just because there's this disease thing. Nothing changed. We already have a system that's set up that specifies what the federal government's authorized powers are, and that's it. Nothing has changed. And the states have their authorized powers both under the US Constitution, which doesn't really delegate anything to them, but under their state constitutions, and that's it. You don't change rules just because things change. Otherwise, your Constitution, your Bill of Rights don't mean anything. I mean, that's the first thing. States, and I think it's actually makes sense that way. Because if you had a federal policy that was applied to Wyoming and that was applied to this, the city of New York, it would make no sense because they're very different places, very different conditions. You can't use the information that's on the ground if you're doing it at a central level.
I do think Charles is particularly right on the point, because in my 105 class, we read Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, and he says exactly that, if you have 105, where he says that it's better off to maintain your Constitution than to do something that is an ad hoc solution, because if you start doing that, then your Constitution isn't going to work at all.
Well, it's meaningless at that point.
But the other thing is, though, there's a practical aspect of this, that states can't go bankrupt. Just that's the way the law is. And so you're having a huge reduction in state and local government revenues as well. And so you may have to do something that you wouldn't otherwise do as a black swan event. What you want to be careful is you don't bail out places like Illinois, who promised their state employees pension benefits that are outrageous and have huge unfunded liabilities in their pension obligations, and end up bailing them out. But I think they're going to have to take a look at possibly the Federal Reserve buying up bonds of state and local governments. Now, Michigan and every state is different in terms of whether the local government can actually issue debt and what kind of debt it can issue. So it may be that you have a two-stage process where the Fed buys state bonds, and then the states then assist the local governments. So, but practicality is if you have a bunch of states defaulting on their bonds, then that could cause problems in the credit markets.
No, I agree with the position of both professors. Let me just take your first question, if I understood it correctly, and that was the balance between a federalism issue or a state. I think for the most part, Trump's been doing a good job in reminding people that states have governors, and it's the governor's responsibility to deal with the issues. And one of the things that we cover, for example, in the U.S. Constitution, is Lincoln's message to Congress in special sessions, in which he articulates this very issue. This relative matter of national power and state rights as a principle is no other than the principle of generality and locality. So the federal government deals with issues that pertain to the whole, whereas governors or states deal with administrating what they have to deal with locally. The problem with that, of course, is depending on who's in office, you can either have a delicate balance of freedom and law, or you can have abuse of power. What I don't often hear, and this is a part of a long conversation Dr. Steele and I have been having, is the impact of these measures are having on the economy. Obviously, we expect officials to want to put in good faith, measures to protect people's health. The problem is we make too sharp a distinction between property and health, or property and rights. And if the purpose of the state and federal government is to protect rights, one of the rights that we have is property. So what I don't hear us having as a national conversation, and even a local conversation, is the impact of these measures on supply chains, on literally on which I would broadly construe to mean, part of their right to life, and how they support their families, and the destruction that delays are causing. And so, whether she's the governor of Michigan is extreme or not can't be answered without having a real economic answer, a really accurate answer as to what the implications of all of this are having on the economy of Michigan and the economy of the nation. I think until we have real, I think until economists help us understand all of the disparate parts that make up a very complicated economy, there's no way to hold these governors accountable to the damage that they might be causing.
If I could say something more, because I want to say something about the federal government bailing out states, because I think that's the first thing that just flashes into my mind is Argentina. I think it's a big mistake to think that I know that states are going to get themselves into trouble, but you've got a real moral hazard problem if the federal government is bailing out states. You are reducing or even removing the incentive for governors to weigh the costs of the shutdown. And there's been almost, I think, no attempt to do that in Michigan. You don't bail them out for that. If they destroy their budget, they're going to have to live with it. You don't take away the incentive to take these things, that you make it that much worse. And when I say Argentina, what happened in Argentina, I'm immediately thinking of the former head of the IMF, Michael Musa. I heard him give a talk on this. He was beside himself with anger because the IMF put conditionality on Argentine government to behave in a fiscally responsible way. And they said, okay, we will. And then they passed everything on to the states. That's what they call them in Argentina. The states all did deficit spending, and then the Argentine government bailed them out, and that's just the way they transferred it. And that's what this is. That's what this is doing. And it was IMF. Reason Musa was upset was IMF never enforced any of their conditionality. But it's exactly that kind of moral hazard problem, and you're reducing the incentive of governors to pay attention to what they're doing when they shut everything down willy-nilly. And the shutting down here has just been, I think some of it's outlandish.
And the political hazard that often, at least historically, has caused is whenever you surrender incentives for local participation and accountability, government always has a tendency to fill the vacuum and centralize authority. One of the things that I'm studying in a private reading group with some faculty is Tocqueville's Reflections on the French Revolution. The more government got involved and the less people were held accountable to their own local areas, the more government centralized. And so there's really a political hazard that can also come out of a moral hazard that Dr. Steele has just mentioned.
Yeah, that's a good point, the moral hazard problem. I'm just a little concerned about what the credit markets are going to look like. And, you know, there is that trade-off.
If I may quote a famous economist, that the credit markets are goofed. He knows who the famous economist is.
Could you explain the relationship of the credit market to the general economy for a layman like myself? I want to be able to understand your concern.
Well, the issue would be if people don't want to buy bonds anymore of state and local governments, what that would do in terms of how you fund things like if you were to build a bridge or you were to do something that the expenditures were going to take place over a long period of time, that you'd be able to, you know, could I sell state transportation bonds to build roads and that kind of thing. So, you know, it's not a major concern to me, but as I was saying, I was looking more towards the Federal Reserve doing it and trying to decide, you know, the members of the Fed trying to take a look at, okay, is this going to create a real problem in, are people willing to buy municipal bonds and state bonds? I mean, those are very big markets for the municipal bond industry and the state bonds. And so there's lots of people that might be holding them indirectly, like any of us might have a mutual fund where you've got, or an exchange traded fund where it's holding municipal bonds. And so you know, like I said, it's not a huge concern to me, but I do think that the Fed ought to be looking at the possibility of buying certain state and local bonds in the same way that they looked at the buying of well, that's a whole nother issue, the last recession.
Were you going to say something about quantitative easing?
Yeah. Someday
in the far future, we're gonna be fiscally responsible, but it'll be long in the long run. We won't be there.
Thank you, by the way. That was I wasn't aware of that. That's a really great point.
Yeah, so actually speaking about being fiscally responsible, there's a trend of central banks around the world kind of being more open about their monetization of debt due to this crisis. You guys have any comments on that recent trend?
Where did my $100 trillion Zimbabwean bill go? That's my first comment. I think it's a bad one. I think it's unfortunate that I mean it seems to me, I think that Dr. Pongrasic sent out a piece recently that it looks like the Federal Reserve is actually kind of moving in that direction. He sent another one out that argued otherwise, but it does look like the Fed might be kind of moving in that direction. And I don't know, let's put it this way. You've got, what you really have with the shutdowns is a real loss of production. You've got a real loss of goods and services. It's real damage to the economy. You can't make that up by printing money. you can maybe keep the system from collapsing worse just by keeping some payments going, but that money is not worth as much as it used to be. They're monetizing the debt. Whether you see inflation coming out or not, they're monetizing, trying to monetize these problems away. And that's at best a stopgap.
Here's a 500 million. This is from Yugoslavia.
Well, that's pretty good.
And that's worth what, 2 cents?
Well, somebody gave it to me, so it could have been worth a lot. Yeah, and in fact, here's a 500 million mark note that was right before the collapse in Germany that ended up with World War II. So, yeah. But I don't think that you have to worry about spending another $3 trillion, to tell you the truth, or $4 trillion. We've already got a $25 trillion deficit or debt to start with. And you got the real issues, unfunded liabilities and Social Security and Medicare. I mean, that's the issue. In fact, if you were to not pass any of the appropriation bills other than the $700 billion defense spending and net interest on the debt, then you'd still run a $400 billion deficit. So, to me, okay, if we have to, we're doing maybe more than we should, but if we have to run an extra $5 trillion to keep local businesses like the Hillsdale Brewing Company in business for 6 months, when you can borrow 30-year Treasury bonds at 1% or 1.14%, we ought to be refunding the entire federal debt is what we ought to be doing. But I'm not concerned about that. I think if you're really worried about the debt to GDP ratio, you're going to have to deal with Social Security and Medicare. To have that's what's driving the deficits every year, and the politics of that is a real problem. But like I said, if we have to borrow an extra $4 trillion at 1% over the next 30 years, I'm not worried about it.
Gary,
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, it's okay, go ahead.
Yeah, you don't want to hear I was going to say Gary completely lost me until he mentioned brewing. And then I thought, yeah, crank the money pump if it brings beer. I guess more to the question of whether all the debt is monetized, it's not just the United States, it's around the world. I mean, this is a really serious problem, and I don't see how central banks are going to have any kind of a incentive to do anything about this until we have a real crisis, financial monetary crisis, because I think that's what it takes. I think you got to go through some real shock to get them to stop doing this. I mean, they've been kind of loosening up over a period of decades, and this is and now we're going to be in the world of MMT soon. I'm afraid.
So the question I have, and I just don't have the economic insights that you have. So forgive me for asking such simple questions, but politically speaking, what is it that drives central banks to want to monetize debt?
Well, because if you don't monetize the debt, then interest rates will start to rise. And as interest rates start to rise, people will look at it, and it was like with Jimmy Carter, when it's 18% to get a car loan, people get irritated with that. And so there becomes political pressure on the Fed to drive interest rates down. And the way they're doing that is by buying bonds, because bond prices and interest rates move in opposite directions. So there's political pressure on the Fed, there's a book that I have my public choice people read called Democracy in Deficit, The Legacy of Lord Keynes, that Buchanan and Wagner wrote in 1977, wherein they argue, work through this economic incentives for once you don't worry about the debt or worry about the deficits, then your people running for Congress propose to make a butterfly museum for Hillsdale and and they're not going to raise your taxes. And so that runs deficits. And then as the deficits get larger, then the Treasury has to sell bonds, which drives up interest rates, which then gets pressure on the Fed to monetize the debt in order to drive interest rates down. So that's the story.
But it sounds like a process once begun has only one way to go, and that's off a cliff. Am I missing something?
That's their argument. And then they propose a constitutional amendment to allow for, to require a balanced federal budget unless there's an emergency. And I think, you know, people would then say, hey, this is an emergency. But nonetheless, over the long term, you really have to deal with that.
Got it.
Now, one of the things you'll notice is there's not been inflation because we now have over $2 billion in, over $2 trillion in excess reserves of banks, when it was about 2 billion until the Fed made all its changes in 2008 and 2009. Another thing I think we need to worry about is if the Fed starts buying stock. You know, what are you going to let the Fed buy? They used to be only buying Treasury bonds, and then during the quantitative easing, they started buying mortgage-backed securities.
They actually started buying those in 2000.
Yeah. Well, that was, yeah.
2000.
Wasn't,
yeah, before. Go ahead.
wasn't part of this recent stimulus that they were part of the quantitative easing package was that they were going to buy stocks, or am I misremembering that?
I'm not sure about stocks, but I think they're buying commercial paper. It's like, I remember someone during about 2009 saying that the Fed had gotten to the point where they were buying the high school boy's love note that he was passing under the desk. They were buying assets like that. I mean, they are buying commercial paper, apparently.
But I do remember, though, a press conference, and a press conference isn't policy, but Trump did indicate that he was open to the possibility of having the federal government purchase stock.
That is going to be a real problem because, in fact, when I was Deputy State Treasurer, I was talking about one of the problems with the state pension fund being able to buy stocks is that suppose that General Motors is opposed to some legislation that is being proposed, and they're opposed to it. And then what happens is the Fed says, well, we're going to sell all our General Motors stock if your lobbyist doesn't come online with this. You can see all sorts of problems with that.
But can't the government say we're just going to be like activist investors?
I think that's the problem.
I was just being facetious. They could take a chapter out of some of those raiders in Wall Street, you know, take these huge positions and then essentially can really make or break a company.
Well, the whole thing would be just a tool for industrial policy and trying to plan the economy. It'd just be a central planning is what you end up with. You could end up with, but it's not a proper role of government to be doing any of that stuff. I don't see how it's even vaguely constitutional, but I guess that's an issue that nobody thinks about anymore, except for weirdos like me.
So kind of talking about central planning and bringing back a little bit to what Dr. Habib said earlier about determining whether the government is acting prudently or abusively with its powers is the determination of the economic devastation. Was it worth it? Was it not worth it? And I read an article the other day by the Mises Institute talking about, and I'd seen this article reflected in other news sources as well, that supply chains are starting to break down. And the governors are mainly acting in an essential, non-essential manner. Is there any reason why, you know, meat packing facilities or these supply chains aren't considered essential? And why is it that things that seem so obvious to be, hey, people are going to need that, are not being counted? Kind of getting into Dr. Steele, that you've been talking with us as well about, like, no job is unessential. Yeah,
nobody's income is unessential to them. So your question is, why have governors not properly factored in things as being essential? It's because a simple answer is because they're not as smart as an ancient Roman. Cicero actually observed that if you ate a loaf of bread in ancient Rome, thousands of people contributed to it. You guys have all read I Pencil. There's a pencil. How many people, who knows how to make a pencil? And how big is that supply chain? And it's literally thousands of people around the world that go into building a pencil or these supply chains. And when they say essential versus non-essential, they don't know what they're talking about. It's just as simple as that. Now, one of the things about the supply chain, or about the packing plants, is in most places they have called those essential, but they're also, they've had, once they get hit, the one in the Smithfield plant in South Dakota, pork packing plant, which is a major producer, major packer and processor of pork, owned by Chinese. Very possibly that's how coronavirus got into the plant, but it spreads through the workers, and then they shut it down. As the governor there said, we would have kept it open regardless. She was criticized for not shutting her whole economy down, but she said that's essential. I mean, that was on the food, the food chain. Let's keep that going. But frankly, they don't understand how these things work. They shut down the restaurants. They almost entirely shut down the hospitality industry, and that's a different supply chain. And now you've got farms in Wisconsin that have, the dairy co-ops are telling their farmers, we can't market this milk that you're producing because we're not hooked into that supply chain. We can't get the kind of packaging to deliver it. We can't get those contracts done, and we can't get around the regulations. Dump it. And they're dumping hundreds of thousands of gallons of milk a day. No fooling, because they can't market.
There's a farmer here that we know in Hillsdale County that is having to dump milk.
And it's, I'm seeing these reports over and over on cattle, on hogs, on chickens and stuff like this. Actually, I'm not sure, but I think chickens. I definitely, I've got contacts in Iowa that I've been in touch with have talked about this. And feedlots now can't, because they can't take any more animals because they can't market them, are as a result way up the supply chain. You have people who are aborting pregnant animals because they won't be able to do anything with the piglets. So that whole supply chain backing up is getting jammed up and broken.
And supply chains are more complicated in a country this vast. Quite often, I think very few people understand the impact of something that they rely on several states away or across the country. And so whatever invisible hand that makes a market work, it's a big hand. And I think very few people have the economic insights that you guys have to figure out, that they're burning one end of the supply chain while thinking they're supporting something local. It has massive consequences. A friend of mine, Dr. Steele, just met yesterday, is in the cigar business. He's a CEO of 3 massive companies. And he was saying, whenever governors decide to tax, for example, cigars, but they don't, and simultaneously don't want more immigration, don't see that what ends up happening is that tax could devastate a farm in Nicaragua that leads to potentially a crash in their economy, creating therefore an incentive to come to America. So they don't even see the connections between the immediate connections between what they're doing locally and what it has not only on supply chains, but even other countries.
Well, with that, I gotta go. Bye-bye.
All right,
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Wolfram.
Thanks, Dr. Wolfram.
Way to Zoom.
Wow, that flew by.
Yeah, definitely. I guess kind of talking about
Dr. Wolfram, just to let you know, his first Zoom experience, he was like super thrilled about this.
that's awesome.
Yeah, CLO breaks some new ground.
Kind of talking about the unintended consequences of, Dr. Habib, you used the example of a tax on cigars or tobacco, and how we were talking about the supply chains breaking it down due to this central planning. Dr. Steele and Dr. Habib, how do you think this will affect businesses Do you think that there's going to be this sort of rational expectations for any time that there's a future crisis, that businesses really could get the short end of the stick from the government going, you know what, you're just going to do what we're going to tell you to do because emergency?
No, I think it has, it doesn't bode well for the future. And a lot of the people that I know two demographics in the economy. Mom and pop shops. I'm in Rhode Island at the moment, and there are certain restaurants that are certain they're not going to return, and they haven't seen any stimulus money. And then I've got friends who run major companies, and they have money. So I think it creates a kind of a class system where the backbone of the economy, the people that you and I will run into on a daily basis, aren't getting what they're claiming to get. It makes for great campaign sound bites when you're running for office. But the real effect is you've only given government more power and more incentive to try to get involved in markets, while not actually doing anything to help those who are in the smaller end of the scale, who actually do keep the economy humming along.
On that line, so first of all, just a question of how people will respond. Probably should talk about this in a little more depth, but just to say that we're going to shut down the non-essential things. And the way at least it's been done in Michigan, nobody knows what's essential until it's unclear when we get these directives. But I think that businesses will just assume they're in the firing line if anything like this happens again. With respect to these small and medium enterprises, a small business in the United States means fewer than 500 employees. So 499 employees is a small business. So it's big. And the National Bureau of Economic Research, the National Association of Business Economists, the MetLife Chamber of Commerce study, and the J.D. Power, all 4 different studies on small businesses and the effect on this, come out about the same, which is that we are in danger of losing 50% or more of our small businesses. 90%, typically, when they do these surveys, 90% don't have enough cash to go for more than a month without a cash flow. Now, they're not all shut down, but the ones that are almost like, you go 2 months and they can't come back. So then the people who were at home, when they go back to work, there's no job for them. How do you make that readjustment? And so this argument that we're going to have this nice sharp V recovery, the longer you go, the more it's going to be like, and it's going to be a long, painful one, because they're destroying small businesses. And the other thing then is that you've got the big ones who survive are just going to be that much more concentrated. And this is not a very nice system, I guess, is what I would say. When you see small town people watching their lives get wrecked, and then a few come out ahead.
Concentrated and also big enough and powerful enough to become very attractive to Washington and vice versa, which only incentivize a further move for government to get involved, not only in central planning, broadly construed, but involvement in economics. So one of the things, if I can just dip into my political theory background, one of the things that Aristotle said always stabilizes in a regime is a strong, thriving middle class, because too rich and too poor, you create extreme problems that incentivize people in power to want to placate one or the other. And we're destroying, I think, people who are in the middle class, who always serve as a moderate means between extremely powerful oligarchic, I don't know what you want to call them, cronyists. And on the other hand, you're sending more people from the middle class to poverty, and that can end up also putting pressure to move toward a bigger welfare state. So I think the unacknowledged hero in all of this is the middle class, the people who do work, the mom and pop stores that we're talking about and know and frequent. And there has to be, we have to focus on them and the consequences of deteriorating their impact in not just economics, but politics.
Definitely. I think Dr. Steele has said before that economic costs are human costs, because economic action is human action. That kind of reminds me of what's been going on, at least across the nation, with the protests and such, that people are experiencing this devastation and they're speaking out about it. I kind of want to get your guys' thoughts on the protests themselves and this political activism, because I've seen a lot of people say that's great and all, and it's great that we have the First Amendment, but now is not the time. We need to stick with the plan. How would you guys respond to this, seeing as that there are those arguments made from a public health standpoint of saving lives?
I would say part of public health is the right to assemble and the right for free speech. I mean, I don't make those distinctions at all. Health should never simply be reduced to just simply physical health. There's also such a thing as economic health and political health. And again, one of the problems that I have is I just, in all honesty, and I'm not trying to be falsely humble, I don't have enough information about the virus. I know what people say about it, but I don't have any real hard knowledge myself. So for me, I don't know if it's really, really bad or if it's overblown. But one thing I know empirically, and I also know just from history, is whenever you undermine or limit the capacity for citizens, especially in a country that is grounded in consent of the governed, to not be able to have the right to assemble, you're going to compromise political health. And so for me, I'm all in favor of it. My attitude for any of these kinds of things is to always allow people to make their own decisions with how they would deal with such a virus before getting government involved.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a lot that could be said, but I hate to show you a meme, but should I? Yeah, why not? There's the meme. I don't know if you can see it. It says, "We are not protesting a lockdown. We are protecting our rights from tyrants." And I would rather live in a dangerous society where I'm free than be a slave in somebody's nice controlled society where nobody can say or do anything without permission.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you could recover from a health crisis, but you very rarely recover from a political crisis. One of the things that we study in the politics department, especially if you take the course on Aristotle and Montesquieu, is political reforms rarely lead to anything good. More often than not, they only accelerate whatever stimulated them to rebel the first time. So I'm all in favor of doing whatever it takes to protect our civil liberties and freedoms.
Awesome. I like that. I think that's an interesting way of looking at being able to recover from a health crisis, but not a political one. Dr. Habib, you said that you have to leave soon. Is there anything that you want to say or comment before you have to go? And then if there's a little bit time left before you go, anyone have any questions of him?
I'll go ahead and ask if, let's just try to maximize the little time that I have left. But let me just say, I'm absolutely honored to be invited in the company of the two professors. And they know a hell of a lot more than I do about economics, but we're completely on the same page. Anything I hear makes sense to me, so.
And thank you for coming. We really appreciate it.
Sure. Does anyone have any questions at all?
I know it's kind of the topical subject right now, but do you have any specific thoughts about the Whitmer office and the Whitmer response?
You know, the cynic in me thinks that this is a theatrical ploy to gain national attention. And to the problem is, if you study politics, and I don't mean like a political scientist, if you're just a political junkie, you know that one of the worst times is during an election year. People do all sorts of demagoguery to get noticed, and I think a lot of it is to try to show she's got total control and that she's tough. This has always been a challenge. Particularly for female candidates, to be noticed in a world dominated by men. And so sometimes you can see them going overcompensating. On the other hand, again, one of the things that always makes me a little bit reluctant to weigh in on the judgment of any official is they may have information that I just simply don't have. I'll give you an academic example of that. When I was just a rank and file faculty member at my former institution, I never understood some of the decisions that our administrators made. When I became an administrator and I had to recruit students, and suddenly I had to really pay attention to enrollment numbers and how I would actually staff the program that I was building, suddenly I started to see a little bit of the thought process that went behind decisions that I formerly didn't quite understand. So I'm a big fan of the more knowledge, the better, and the more knowledge that we have. I mean, for all I know, maybe Detroit really is bad. I mean, and the nature of Detroit and the way in which people travel and initially weren't taking it seriously could in fact spread to other parts of Michigan. I don't know. My knee-jerk reaction would be to allow the free market and people's own choices to determine what's best and how to respond before having government. Because once government gets involved, state or national, it's extremely hard to remove it. It's and to curtail it and reduce it.
I had a.
Do you think that even with sorry.
No, go ahead.
Do you think that even with, so if there had been no official government lockdowns or stay-at-home orders or anything, do you think we would have seen a pronounced change in people's tastes for public gatherings or for public events? Like how much of this response could have happened naturally?
There's only so much you can force people to do. One way to get around it is to just do a lockdown, and there's no saying what you have avoided, it's not kind of like trying to prove a negative. On the other hand, I was trying to imagine, for example, I had a number of lectures that the college had set up for me around the country. And I was trying to imagine if there was, if government was not, it was not possible for them to call the order to lockdown, and it was completely up to me. What would I have done? I would have taken precautions. And I did actually, when I traveled down to give a talk in Alabama, when we just started hearing about this, I wore a mask, I sanitized everything. And, I think all I would have done is I wouldn't have changed my behavior. I would have, in terms of where I wanted to go, but I would have taken extra precautions. But now I don't have a choice. Almost every restaurant around us is closed. All schools are closed. Both of our boys weren't able to return to school. We haven't seen any refund, by the way, in dorm room or anything like that. I would much rather have had the option to allow people to decide, do you want your son or daughter to return to college? And then you'd have the option for online. I think at some point you got to just give people, the option to choose. Last comment on this, a friend of mine here is a local businessman, very successful. He said they determined that his mother actually must have had coronavirus in February. She had all the symptoms, and she was out cold exactly as everybody has been describing. And she also developed pink eye, which apparently shows up. They're now discovering that's one of the most visible symptoms of it. So she had every single box checked. And she has diabetes, a bad bladder, and I can't remember how old he said she was, and now she's fine. So people were already coming into contact with it before it was more visible, so it's so hard to know. It's so hard to know.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me on these issues is the I just saw it. I was trying to look it up and I couldn't find it, but there was a piece that just came out. Someone had looked at the numbers on a per capita basis. And if you take the states that are run by Democrat governors, the states run by Republican governors, the Republican states have a third, that is the Democrat states have 3 times the number of coronavirus deaths that Republicans have. And if you eliminate New York, because New York is an outlier, the worst one, it's still more than 2 times. So it's pretty dramatic. And the Democrats apparently have been much more, I guess, draconian in the shutdown. It's not clear to me how well this shutdown works. Now, you can't reach conclusions from that because correlation, maybe these were the worst places and they'd have been a lot worse if the Democrats hadn't shut down. But it is a little bit suspicious because those are pretty dramatic numbers. I'm skeptical. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I'm sure skeptical of them at this point. But I don't quite understand the idea where it's been explained that the shutdown is supposed to level out stretch out the curve. And the idea is not that it reduces the number of deaths, it's that it spreads it out over a longer period of time so it's more manageable. That's got huge economic costs involved, and nobody took any attempt to figure out that I can see how to balance those economic costs, which also kill people, with the people that apparently we're not saving in terms of numbers of lives. So I'm a little suspicious of all of that. When you ask about our governor here in Michigan, there were some things that she did that make no epidemiological sense. And one was to say people can go into Walmart or Meijer or any of those stores, but they have to fence off the seeds and the gardening tools and the plants and the paint and the furniture. You can do anything else there, but you can't buy those. No epidemiological sense in the least to that. You cannot buy a car online where you never even meet anybody, but that's shut down. There's no epidemiological reason for that kind of stuff. So they've stated those things specifically when it's been requested that they relax them. So I'm pretty suspicious of her.
Well, I don't know if you guys have seen Woody Allen's Bananas. Have you guys seen that? It's actually quite funny. There's no surer sign of tyranny than arbitrary decrees that make absolutely no sense, like Dr. Steele just mentioned. So when he finally basically elects himself as tyrant, he announces in this, what looks like, some Latin American country, the official language is now Swedish, and nobody can understand why on earth he put that forward. It's like, why would you section off seeds and cars? I didn't even know about that with the cars. No, it's crazy. But anyhow, I do have to jump. I've got to jump into my office, my virtual office hours. Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it. Keep up the good work.
Thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Likewise, take care.
Have a good one.
I think he should just have had his students join this.
Oh, yeah.
Not the regular office hours.
So we are set to talk for about at least 10 more minutes, if you'd like. Dr. Steele, you did send that article to us to talk and such. And is there anything you want to talk about in regard to that in the relation of like the economic decision-making stuff? I know we've talked about it quite a bit, and I think we've gotten most of the points home, but is there anything that you feel like, man, this really needs to be said?
Well, so people tamper with these supply chains and things, and because it seems very simple to someone sitting in an armchair someplace. And so Dr. Habib said that Wolfram and I know a lot more about that. Look, what we really know is that we shouldn't tamper with it, because nobody can sit in their armchair and figure out what these connections are. And I think about how complex they are. There was one, I can't remember if I mentioned this to you in our previous example, but you think about what's essential. What about recycling of t-shirts? That doesn't sound very essential to me. There's actually a business that separates cotton t-shirts from non-cotton, like the synthetic, the ones that have some polypro or whatever they put in them. And they separate those out, and that's their business. Well, that can't possibly be important, right? Well, as it turns out, they take the cotton t-shirts, they have to separate them, because the cotton t-shirts are then recycled into scrubbers that are used in pipelines for things like oil and natural gas. And if you use cotton, it works. And if you use the other ones, it becomes explosive. Well, natural gas turns out to be pretty important because more than 90% of our fertilizer and our agricultural chemicals come from natural gas. The safest, easiest, and main way to transport it is through pipelines. Well, that all starts sounding kind of essential to me, because you need that stuff to grow food. I realize that's hard for governors sometimes to understand, but apparently, farming is important. But then so is the stuff that it depends on, and that's includes the processing of recycled t-shirts. I would never have guessed something like that. There are all kinds of things around us that we don't even know about, that governors, politicians, economists don't know about. But if you let the market coordinate it, there are people, you only need a few people who understand it, and then they'll be coordinated by prices, and it will move through this big chain, and you end up with pencils and things. So tampering with that is just don't do it. And they've done it so crudely. And again, the question is, and I was on the radio the other day in Traverse City, and they asked me this question. I said, look, when I talk about economic costs, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis has predicted a 32% unemployment rate out of this. And that if just on historical data, not some epidemiological model, but historical data, if you go ahead and when you raise the unemployment rate by a percentage, you can calculate the excess deaths that will come from suicide and from drug and alcohol abuse. And a 32% unemployment rate would mean we'd have 77,000 excess deaths. And so far, that would be more than have died from coronavirus. And if it's really the flattening the curve doesn't even save anyone, it just spreads it out, then we traded then if that happens, 32% unemployment rate, we traded 77,000 deaths just to slow down the 55,000 or however many deaths. So the fact that the people don't take this stuff into account, the decision makers, is to me a travesty.
And I know in the article you said not only should we shouldn't be just classing things as essential and non-essential, but what can be done safely and not safely. And even if something is non-essential but can be done safely, it should be done to reduce those unemployment numbers and give people livelihoods.
So supposing you're talking about, I don't know, selling, I don't know, cigars or atlatls or whatever. Atlatls being my favorite. Okay, maybe we can't survive without atlatls, but suppose we could. Just, we can make wild assumptions as economists. Well, if you can do it safely, if you're doing it through the internet, order stuff online and send it out, why not? There was recently an interview with a gentleman who owns several car dealerships. And he said, we have often done it where we have sold automobiles, new cars, to people in other states and we never even meet them. We can do that. And the governor has told us we can run our service department. You can drive your car in and get your oil changed. We can't sell you a car by internet, even though we'll never meet you. And he said, he says, my dealerships are about to go bankrupt. We are not going to come back. And they're killing us. And we asked the governor if we can't do that. And he said, no. And that's the kind of thing that you think, well, this is just government that's out of control. I'll tell you something else, and this is, I haven't written this anyplace, but if you look at the way that the Soviet economy worked, the way it worked on paper was not the way it actually worked in the real world, because it was so dysfunctional. The planners they faced these same problems and they couldn't solve them, and they tried to do it, wholesale. And what actually happens is markets spring up. And I was not in the Soviet Union, but in the post-Soviet Union, as much as 30% of their economy was all underground stuff. That's what's going to happen if this kind of stuff continues. That's very ineffective, but it also is it's destructive in a number of ways. But people are going to have to start their economies back up in order to survive if this shutdown stuff isn't stopped. And so really it makes more sense to me to just say, look, this would be safe, this kind of an activity would be safe, that would not be. So I don't know, shaking hands, kissing, hugging, unsafe, or something like that. Or things that involve proximity, but you set those as being guidelines. And then you say, whatever it is you're doing, find a way to do it so it's safer. Let the entrepreneurs find safer ways of doing things. Maybe I don't know, maybe there's a safe way to cut hair or something like that, or to really mitigate that risk. Let people try to find that thing. Don't try to centrally plan it in Lansing or DC or someplace like that. Just say, safe versus non-safe. Don't do non-safe things. People don't want to get this disease. I'm pretty sure of that. So I think people would find those things. Makes more sense to me.
That's fair. Well, we are getting to about an hour. So I was thinking if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them of Dr. Steele. And then Dr. Steele, if there's anything that you want to say where it's like, people who are listening to this, you need to know this in summarizing everything. I figure we'll close on a comment like that.
Questions?
I don't really have a question, but I guess a comment, like that kind of model that you basically laid out, like voluntary, like guidelines. That kind of sounds like Sweden to me, at least what they're doing. As far as I know, the only big kind of like legal thing that they have is you can't gather with more than 50 people. Their schools are open, their restaurants are open, but through these guidelines, these places of gathering kept kind of like voluntarily, like say they put stools or like tables like 6 feet apart. And I think a big part of their economy has now moved towards like online. Like if you can work from home, you're working from home. But none of that is like enforced through the government, and they're still doing like fairly well as far as I can see.
Yeah, I know we'd been talking about some of that. I'm gonna see if I can bring up some. So on per capita cases for coronavirus, Switzerland, Spain, and Italy are at the top of the list, not Sweden. And Sweden's approached this differently. So this is on a cases per million, which is better, better way of doing it. So Sweden is not even on the list of the top 10. Top 12 I've got right there, and Sweden doesn't appear. So, the Swedish method at least has not been a disaster.
Anyone else?
Is that Jeff Lantis there?
Should be.
If it is, questions?
Yes, it is, Charles. Jeff Lantis here, listening intently to these wonderful comments that are being made.
Good. Do you have any questions or observations or anything?
Well, I don't. We read all about this and try to sort it all out, and I love the economic take on all this, but we certainly are looking at it politically. We're looking at it from a health perspective, and it's just very difficult to find truth in all of this.
No fooling. I have half a notion just to rant and rave about epidemiologists, but I think one of the problems is that I said this when I was on the radio the other day, that I started out and I told them, look, I'm an expert. And so you should listen really closely to what I say, because you will learn something, and then go make your decision. Do not let an expert make your decisions for you. Definitely don't put an epidemiologist in charge, because that epidemiologist knows epidemiology and can't take anything else into account. Economists are a little bit better because we are used to making the cost benefit trade-off is embedded in what we do. Don't let economists make your decisions either. There's too much stuff involved. And it takes wisdom and judiciousness and caution to do these, and prudence and these things, to make decisions. And don't let experts run things. We're better off letting people make their own decisions.
Absolutely agree with that. With that, if there are no other questions, I think we'll call that an event. Is there anyone else who wants to say something?
Thanks, gentlemen. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you for everyone who coming here. I know it's busy with exams and such. Thank you, Dr. Steele, for making this time available. I really appreciate it.
I will simply say that the Classical Liberal Organization is a real pioneer in this stuff and has done great. So thanks for all you guys have done.
Thank you, Dr. Steele.
Thanks, Dr. Steele.